First, though, in June, the European Commission will say how it thinks the EU could finance itself through new EU taxes. But this week, here in Strasbourg, a rather more radical vision was unveiled.
For many Euro enthusiasts, the rot really started when Margaret Thatcher famously demanded her money back.
It is not asking the community for money, it is asking the community to have our own money back.
The British rebate was born, and with it a whole new way of doing business and financing the EU through national contributions rather than dedicated taxes and other sources of income. The British rebate led to a whole series of demands by others to adjust what they put in and get back. That means not just the United Kingdom, but Austria, the Netherlands, Germany and Sweden too all have their own mini rebates. This week, a trio of prominent federalists in the European Parliament said enough was enough. They're proposing the EU starts to finance itself, doing away with those national contributions and their rebates completely. They propose a series of measures that are bound to be controversial. On the list of possibilities, a financial transaction tax across the EU, revenue from the emissions trading scheme, an air transport tax, an EU VAT, an energy tax, and a corporate tax. Some of these proposals may appeal to some EU governments, but getting agreement across the board could prove very difficult, and this is an area where the national veto can still put a stop to the whole thing.
Well, to talk about this critical issue, I'm joined by three members of the European Parliament. We have Graham Watson, who's a British Liberal Democrat, formerly the leader of the European Liberals at the Parliament. We have Nigel Farage, who leads the UK Independence Party MEPs here. And we have Dan Jørgensen, who leads the Danish Social Democrat MEPs. Graham, why do you think a change is needed to the current system? We are now entering into a phase now to negotiate the next sort of several years' budget for the EU.
Well, the current system serves nobody well. What happens is every 5 years the heads of state and government come together and they go through a process of horse trading to try to agree who is paying in how much to the European Union budget after agreeing how much the European Union is going to need for the following 5-year period. It serves nobody well. We have a terrible argument every year with individual chancellors of the exchequer asking for money back if there's any unspent at the end of the year, and then we have to decide how much goes back to whom and so forth. What is being argued, and I think quite rightly, is that the European Union needs to have an independent source of finance, and that could mean increasing the amount of the VAT take which goes to the European Union coffers, or it could mean the imposition of a carbon tax, which the governments want to do anyway, because they recognise we've got to get serious about fighting climate change, and the European Union being financed from that.
I mean, I know, Nigel, you don't agree with the idea of this, and you know, the phrase EU tax has come from many of your press releases.
Sure.
But you would agree, wouldn't you, though, that the current system isn't transparent, it's a bit of a dog's dinner, and it doesn't really let the general public know how their money's being spent?
That, of course, is true. The current system is a horse trading negotiation that goes on and finishes at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning when the heads of state get together. And I remember the last one when Mr. Blair came out looking haggard, having given away a further £7 billion of the British rebate. So you can argue that this system's imperfect. However, to replace it with the European Union itself taking on the attributes of a state and directly raising its own taxes, I think raises a whole bigger question, because we're still, certainly in Britain, under the illusion that the EU is still about cooperation between member states. And what we see with this proposal is a direct attempt at the EU becoming a government. And I don't think people want that.
Do people in Denmark want that kind of thing, do you think, Dan?
I think definitely the people in Denmark agree with what Graham said, that it's not transparent. It's not fair either. The way that the money is spent and the way that the contributions are divided between the countries are not always fair, that's for sure. On the other hand, going for a completely new system with 100% own finances, resources in EU is also something that I think we need to be a little bit careful about, because taxation needs to be a national competency. So what I think we should do is look for solutions in the middle.
Yes.
I think there's one solution that's pretty obvious, and that is a financial transaction tax, because I think that most people in Europe, not Nigel, I'm aware of that, but most people in Europe would argue that transactions taking place on the international financial transaction market is by definition international. And it's also a sector that doesn't pay much tax today. So really, you wouldn't take something away from the nation states. You'd create a new revenue, and you'd do it in an area where it's only fair.
Nigel?
I mean, what that would result in, I have no doubt, and I should really cheer to the rafters what you've just said. What that would result in is the UK making a choice. Are we a member of the European Union, or do we keep our biggest single industry, which is financial services? We talk about the city, but actually it's across the whole of the UK. You know, 20% of our tax take in the United Kingdom is directly from financial services. And the financial transaction tax, which I think is a mad idea, because what it would do is drive business, not just to Zurich, but across to Singapore and those massively emerging eastern markets. It would do that. No. And actually, that tax would fall disproportionately upon Britain, much greater than any other member, because our financial sector is a bigger part of our economy.
Okay, well, we can have that argument about that another time, but I mean, it doesn't have to be a financial transaction tax. The other suggestions could be a carbon tax, an aviation tax, lots of ideas like that.
And I mean, the argument that somehow this would be a European tax, which Nigel was using, is wrong, because this would not be levied by the European Commission. You're not suddenly going to have an army of tax collectors in Brussels. This is a tax that will be levied by national governments within their existing tax systems, but the proceeds of the tax would go to pay for the European Union.
What's the difference, Graham? What's the difference? This would be agreed at European level. Yes. It would be agreed
if there's no difference,
where national governments, in fact, arguably haven't even got a veto over this.
So even agreed by national governments at European level.
Even if the British government disagreed with it, it could happen anyway, and then the proceeds of that go directly to the European Union. That is direct taxation.
Isn't there one level on which you can argue the current system, which you say yourself is very untransparent, it's all about horse trading? At least if you have a system whereby a tax is levied at home, it's specifically for the EU, isn't there more accountability in that system?
Well, there is an argument, certainly with green taxes, that if every time you pay your electricity bill, printed on the bottom is that £101.46 of this are going directly to Brussels, I suppose I could say maybe that would help my cause and not the other side of the argument. But you know, we are talking about direct taxation is what states do. Now, if these guys are happy to tell us that this is now a state and that the UK is subordinate to that, then fine, but they're not.
This was the way that the EU used to finance itself, actually. I mean, that's worth remembering, isn't it?
We already have 25% of the resources in the EU coming from own resources, so it's already there. It's just a question of how big a proportion. Plus, this new idea really is taking money from a sector that's for too long been making a lot of money without paying their part to the societies, and that is actually awful.
They paid their part,
and that's probably where we have an ideology.
Let's go back to the rebate. Let's go back to the rebate system. I mean, this current system, whereby, I mean, not a lot of people know. I mean, we do. That it's not just the British that have a rebate. There are 4 others as well.
Indeed.
It's highly complicated, isn't it? But Dan, you were saying that there is a sense that that in itself is quite unfair. The British rebate, whatever happens, there's a definite move to get rid of that, isn't there?
It's quite clear that it is unfair.
Why?
Well, Britain is a net contributor. That's how they argue that they should have a rebate. Now, Denmark is also a net contributor. Every Brit pay around €30 a year to the EU net. Every Dane pay €175. So how is it that I explain to my constituency that out of that 175, 20 I give directly to you guys? How do I argue that?
How do you explain it?
I say it's not fair, simply.
This is exactly why the system needs to be reviewed, and we need a new system. And it is probably why, in the end, the governments will agree. They will be the ones who will come forward and say, we've got to find a way of doing this which is fair to every country, fair to the individual taxpayers in every country, but which gives the European Union the finances it needs to do the things we need it to do.
But we know that the rebate is a sacred cow, and parties like Nigel will be on there right away saying, you know, you've sold it down the river, you've sold us down the river.
The rebate was put in place for Britain because we are not a European country. We are different. Our farming system was different.
And
unlike your countries, we're a global nation. We do a bigger proportion of our trade and our business with the rest of the world than any other European country. We always have, and my hope is that we'll go on doing that.
Denmark
so that's
is a
why.
global nation. Germany is a global nation.
Germany is not a global nation
The Netherlands?
compared with Britain. They're not. None of them are. We have a much greater proportion of trade across the world. But you know, this argument about what it costs British people, whether we talk gross or net, this year our net contribution to the EU is going to be £9 billion. And what people see is they see in their own lives at the moment, you know, the local gravedigger or sweet sweeper being sacked as a result of local government cuts. And what they see here is a massive increase in the EU's Parliament's 80% increase in the entertainment budget. In this very building we're in downstairs, there is a fleet of cars that you can't believe. Today we voted for there to be a European House of History. I mean, can you not see that ordinary taxpayers that are suffering think these institutions are arrogant and out of touch?
OK, massive increase in the EU's budget, Nigel is saying, a massive increase in the Parliament's budget. Is that what you voted for?
You let him get away with this without answering a very simple question.
No, I'm giving you the chance to...
How do I tell my constituency that we are net payer as well, except every Dane pays 3 times as much to the EU as the British?
Well, if you're getting a worse deal than us, that's a comparison of misery, isn't it? And you should be arguing that your people shouldn't be paying much money into this either.
No, what I am arguing is that it's too simple a way of putting it. What you need to see is, okay, how much does the European Union matter to ordinary people in Europe?
Very little.
It matters a lot. We make common rules on environments. We make common rules. Well, one of the reasons some of them hate it is because people like you don't tell...
Your country said no in a referendum, do it?
Listen.
Twice.
Great. Let Dan finish his sentence and I'll come to
Graham. The Danish people, and they keep saying no.
You know, the way you argue is one of the reasons people don't like politicians in my country. We try to be a little bit more polite, but that's different, of course.
Graham, let's hear from Graham.
Yeah, where Nigel's argument falls down is he said it's terrible that the UK is paying £9 billion every year in net to the European Union, which will be the case next year. But what he doesn't point out is that we're paying £60 billion a year for health, we're paying £132 billion a year for social security and pensions. For £9 billion, it's all it's costing us. We're getting a fantastic deal from the European Union. We're getting the solidarity of being part of an association of 27 nations. We're getting the diplomatic clout that it gives us. We're getting the clout that it gives us in trade talks, such as our free trade agreement with India, for example.
We don't exist.
We are getting all of the benefits of all of the European policies which bring money into my constituency every year.
Outside of the EU, we could negotiate our own trade deal with India. As part of the EU, we're banned from doing so.
Outside
and
of
you talk
EU,
about influence.
We would be like Norway. We would have to pay more money to trade.
Well, the Norwegians are rather richer than we are, aren't they?
Than we currently pay as a
And they keep their own fish.
We'd have to pay more money to trade.
I'd love to be in Norway.
All right, well, as usual, we always get back down to fundamentals. Thanks very much, all of you.